speak about sanctions and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I initially thought that I would talk about the destructive aspects of the way in which the sanctions have affected the Korean people. Some examples could have been examples of malnutrition and the number of people that are faced with insecurity. The UN studies have documented that 41% of the people of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea are undernourished, and 70% are food insecurity. And the prevalence of child stunting is about 39.4% of all of the children in the DPRK. Sanctions are changing the countries in many other ways as well. Major humanitarian organizations have been forced to leave because of the UN sanctions. Global Fund, which over the last 8 years gave more than $100 billion of life-saving treatment to patients of tuberculosis, AIDS, and malaria in North Korea, has had to leave North Korea because of the sanctions. Less attention has been given to the fact of healthcare in general. In fact, the sanctions have created obstacles so great that even the UN has not been able to provide a banking channel that UN organizations or NGOs can use to transfer funds to our standard program in North Korea. I would have gone into some detail about the sanctions resolution, for example, 2397, which states all member states shall prohibit direct or indirect supply, sale, transfer to the DPRK of all industrial machinery, transportation vehicles, iron, steel, and other metals. Sanctions have even been interpreted to block fingernail clippers, which the MCC tried to send in our health kits to pediatric hospitals in North Korea because it was determined that fingernail clippers were made of metal, and metal was sanctioned by UN Security Council 2397. One could actually argue that the sanctions that the UN has imposed are actually collective punishment, which has been a violation of international humanitarian law since the Hague Regulations of 1899, and more specifically, the Geneva Convention number 4, Article 33. This is another good reason to end the Korean War. We wouldn't want the Security Council to actually be convicted of war crimes for doing collective punishment, which we know is a violation. Security Council Resolution 1718 is quite clear as to what are the goals of the sanctions. And I thought it would be most important for us to actually, rather than looking at the sanctions in detail, to look at the issue of efficacy. What is the result? What are we trying to achieve? And how are we trying to, and how successful are we in reaching those goals? So in Resolution 1718 makes very clear that the reason for the sanctions is basically to discourage the DPRK from pursuing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, and to encourage the return of the DPRK to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So let's look at the success of the sanctions and compare that with the accomplishments of dialogue. As for sanctions, the UN Security Council significantly increased its sanctions on October 14th, 2006, in Security Council Resolution 1718, 5 days after the DPRK detonated the first nuclear explosion. In the last 12 years, the UN has passed more than 10 resolutions sanctioning the DPRK, each of them more draconian than the previous one. During the last 12 years of sanctions, the DPRK has detonated 5 additional nuclear tests as well as continue to improve the range of the missiles from rockets, which were intermediate range in 2006, to missiles today that are capable of reaching the United States. Now let's look at the accomplishments of persuasion in just the last 9 months. Chairman Kim Jong-un, in his last New Year's speech in January 1st, 2018, stated, "We will open our doors to anyone from South Korea, including the ruling party and opposition parties, organizations and individual personages of all backgrounds, for dialogue, contact, and travel, if they sincerely wish national accord and unity. As for the Winter Olympic Games, which will soon be held in South Korea, it will serve as a good occasion for demonstrating our nation's prestige and our earnest wish for the Olympic Games' success. From this point of view, we're willing to dispatch our delegation and adopt other necessary measures with regard to this matter. The authorities in the North and the South may meet together soon, since we are compatriots of the same blood as the South Koreans, and it is natural for us to share their pleasure over this auspicious event and to help them." Chairman Kim's New Year's statement was welcomed by President Moon Jae-in, who immediately invited the DPRK to send athletes from the North to join the Olympics, and even filed a joint women's hockey team for the 2018 Olympic Games. Since then, there have been numerous meetings at various levels between the DPRK and the ROK, as well as joint meetings in Singapore with President Trump and Chairman Kim on June 12th, earlier this year. Since January 2018, DPRK has suspended all nuclear testing, all missile launches, demolished its only nuclear testing site, destroyed the rocket engine testing site. They have returned the remains of U.S. service personnel killed during the Korean War. ROK and DPRK have worked together to establish liaison office in the Kaesong Industrial Complex in DPRK, and have established a program for reunification of Korean families who were separated by the war, and just last week held another Inter-Korean Summit this year in Pyongyang. These are only a few of the major changes that have been initiated as a result of dialogue. It is hard to remember that it was only 1 year ago, at the opening of the General Assembly last year, that President Trump and Chairman Kim were threatening each other with nuclear annihilation. Since the beginning of time, people have been arguing which is stronger, hard power or soft power, the use of force or the arts of dialogue. There is an ancient Greek fable which tells of an argument between the north wind and the sun as to who was more powerful. They argued for many days, each boasting their superior strength, and finally decided to settle the argument by a contest. A pilgrim was traveling below, so they decided they would try to remove his coat. The north wind went first, blowing gale-force winds, which tore away at the coat. But the pilgrim grabbed his cloak, and the harder the wind blew, the more tightly the pilgrim wrapped his cloak around himself. When it came to the sun's turn, the winds and the clouds disappeared, and the sun beamed its kind warmth on the pilgrim, who immediately took off his coat. In the past 12 years, we have witnessed the abject failure of the use of sanctions and military threats to get the DPRK to dismantle its program of nuclear weapons and intercontinental missiles. It's now time for us to support the power of dialogue, which has already begun between Chairman Kim, President Moon, and President Trump.